So in doing research, I found that there are several online articles and events that led to the Revolutionary War. I know that it varies from person to person, but unanimously, I think we can all agree that it was originally under British rule. But to make this more interesting, I'm going to go back a little bit further. Oh, did I say a little bit? I mean way back. How far back, you may ask? As far back as America's discovery. The reason is because I want to try and keep this video as structured as possible, and to do that, I think it's best to cover early origins. But don't worry, I'll make it quick, and then we'll go on to discuss the revolution that followed. Now, in order to talk about this properly, I'll start by asking the obvious question, who discovered America first? One would say Christopher Columbus. That's what we were taught in elementary school, before we all grew up and realized, oh yeah, that's bullshit. Instead, America's first real discovery, according to many documents, and the one that is widely accepted by most scholars, can be traced back to the Viking Age. Around 1000 AD, Viking explorer Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red of Norway, arrived at a place called Vinland, an area that is now the Canadian province of Newfoundland. However, Eric and his crew didn't stay for very long because relations with Native North Americans was described as very hostile. Now that we got that over with, let's travel a few hundred years later. The American Revolution actually dated back to the French Revolution with the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War involved overseas colonial struggles between Britain and France, with the main struggle being fought over North America. Lasting from 1756 to 1763, the war was fought between Great Britain and Prussia, and the allied forces of France, Austria, Russia, Spain, and Sweden. After 9 years, and yeah, let me explain that too, despite being called the 7 Years' War, it actually lasted 9 years because it originated in North America 2 years before the war was officially declared in Europe. This was due to the French and Indian War, which was the result of an ongoing frontier escapade in North America, specifically tensions boiling over control of the Ohio Territory by French and British colonists. The Indian part comes from Native Americans fighting on both sides, and I'm going to stop myself right there, or else I'm going to lose focus and keep droning on like fucking Ben Stein. Shifting back to the end of the 7 Years' War, or whatever, it ended like most wars do with lots of fighting, bloodshed, massive debt, but thankfully a good resolution. Specifically, 2 important treaty agreements that redrew the map of colonial power. The first of these was the Treaty of Paris, which involved France, Great Britain, and Spain, with Portugal included despite being invaded several times, and their colony being taken over, essentially being as useless as that short, bald minion. Fortunately, the Treaty of Paris required Spain to return all Portuguese territory, as well as requiring France to give all of its North American territories east of Mississippi, including Canada, to Great Britain, and Louisiana to Spain. Spain gave Florida to Great Britain, and got Havana, Cuba back in return. I should also mention that this is the first of 3 Treaty of Paris agreements. The second one being the one that ends the American Revolution, which we'll get to much later, and the third one, which is a discussion for a whole nother video. Anyways, despite the massive amounts of land that Great Britain acquired, it also left their asses with massive amounts of debt. As a result of this, Great Britain began taxing people to pay off these debts, sparking this classic principle.
That's called taxation without representation, and it's not fair.
And not fair it very much was. The British Parliament began imposing a series of highly controversial acts, and while British citizens had to pay roughly 26 shillings per year, colonists had to pay only a fraction of that. Only 1 shilling, which in modern America is the equivalent of 5 cents. Key acts included the Sugar Act, which increased sales of imported goods like sugar, coffee, and wine. Then there was the Stamp Act, which was the first direct taxing on colonists. Its name comes from the rule that revenue stamps had to be required on all paper products, ranging from legal documents and diplomas to playing cards and newspapers. There was also the Townshend Acts, which were indirect taxes imported on essential items like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Speaking of which, finally, there was the Tea Act, which granted monopoly on the tea trade to the British East India Company. Needless to say, these tax acts did not go over well, and protesters soon emerged. At this time, Great Britain was under the command of King George III, and in 1768, he deployed over 1,000 troops to occupy Boston, and this constant military presence would end in disaster. On March 5, 1770, a mob of colonists began taunting a British sentry, pelting him with snowballs, ice, and stones. As the crowd grew, guards were subjected to verbal harassment and had various things thrown at them. When the crowd was ordered to disperse, The soldiers in the area fired into the crowd without command. This event would come to be known as the Boston Massacre. In the event, 3 civilians were killed and 2 more injured, who would later both die from their injuries. Chris Benedix, an African-American man, was supposedly the first person killed in the event, and he would go on to be a symbol of the abolitionist movement. 8 soldiers, 1 officer, and 4 civilians were all arrested and charged with murder, and during trial they were represented by none other than John Adams. 2 were convicted, and the civilians were all acquitted. Meanwhile, colonists were still protesting against the taxation without representation. As a form of protesting, on December 16, 1773, several colonists disguised as Native Americans participated in what would come to be known as the Boston Tea Party. At 7 p.m. that night, around 150 men boarded 3 ships on the Boston Harbor, the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and the Eleanor, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water to protest against the Tea Act. These men were known as the Sons of Liberty, which was an organization dedicated to resist taxation and protect colonial rights. The name came from a speech given at the British Parliament by Isaac Barre, who was also a defender of the colonists, and many of its leaders would go on to become key figures in the upcoming revolution, including Samuel Adams, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Paul Revere. Following the Boston Tea Party, Great Britain passed the Intolerable Acts between March and June of 1774, also known as the Coercive Acts throughout Britain. These were a series of punitive, extremely unfair laws created to isolate the state of Massachusetts. The Intolerable Acts consisted of 5 laws. Among these were the Boston Port Act, which closed the Boston Harbor to oil commerce until the colonists paid for all the destroyed tea. Then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, which banned town meetings without approval and placed the colony under pretty much permanent military rule. There was also the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British officials charged with capital crimes like murder and attuning to riots to have their trials moved to England, shielding them from colonial accountability. Rather than isolating Massachusetts as intended, however, it ended up bringing the colonies more together than ever before. At the same time, Thomas Gage, the state's appointed royal governor and the one who drafted the Coercive Acts, was facing the threat of an outright rebellion. In response, he ordered the seizure of all weapons and powder in Concord. On April 18, 1775, Paul Revere and other writers sounded the alarm that, in Revere's words,
"The British are coming! The British are coming!"
One shot heard around the world later, and so began the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Around 93 American soldiers and 300 British soldiers were killed. In the wake of the battle, Governor Gage found Boston faced by a militia of men who arrived from New England to fight for liberty, and these 20,000 men would become part of the Continental Army. The Continental Army was a unified military force of the 13 colonies, with the commander-in-chief being this one man named George Washington. This takes us to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought on June 17, 1775. That day, Thomas Gage, who was now the British commander-in-chief, planned to launch an attack against the Americans on the heights north and south of Boston. However, plans of the attack got leaked, and a total of 1,000 Massachusetts and Connecticut soldiers gathered to defend the hill in Charlestown. The name Bunker Hill comes from George Bunker, a wealthy landowner who settled in the area in the 1600s. Although most of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill, which was a third of a mile away, Bunker Hill was the intended target of both armies. An estimated 1,532 soldiers died, 450 of them American, and 1,054 British. Although the battle was a British victory, it proved that the colonists could hold their own against the British Army, and on July 3rd, George Washington assumed command in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On July 5, 1775, the Olive Branch Petition was adopted and signed on July 8th. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft, and it was signed by prominent figures John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin, along with 46 other colonial representatives. This document was, and still is, highly significant because George III's refusal to formally receive it pushed Congress much further to drafting the Declaration of Independence. In December 1775, the Battle of Quebec was fought under the command of General Richard Montgomery, and Colonel Benedict. I snubbed the Continental Bastards because I always get picked last in Dodgeball Arnold. As a result of his betrayal to the army, the battle was a British victory, and any chance the Americans had of making Canada part of the colonies went completely out the door. A total of 115 soldiers were lost as well, making the battle one of the lowest points in this entire story. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee proposed the Lee Resolution to the Second Continental Congress, arguably the very first draft of the Declaration of Independence. This document declared the independence of the 13 colonies from the British Empire. In the summer of that same year, British General Henry Clinton attacked Fort Sullivan just outside of the city of Charleston, South Carolina, provoking the Battle of Sullivan's Island. It was a Patriot victory, forcing the British to evacuate and set sail for the Atlantic. Charleston was informed of the good news, and loud cheers erupted throughout the city. 6 days later, on this very day, July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted in Philadelphia and signed by 56 state delegates on August 2nd. It was created by the Committee of Five: John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, who also wrote the majority of it. John Hancock was the first to sign, and Thomas McKean of Virginia was the last. This is where America's freedom proudly begins, and it is where I would stop, but the war itself is far from over. Beginning in September 1777, the Battle of Saratoga was fought in upstate New York and was a decisive American victory. Following the battles of Trenton and Princeton, in which America gained New York City back from the British Army, General John Burgoyne proposed a three-pronged attack on the city of Albany in order to cut New England colonies away from those south and west of the Hudson River. Lord Germain, the British minister in charge of the war, officially gave Burgoyne permission to start his campaign earlier that spring. However, Burgoyne's campaign was riddled with issues involving communication, and on October 17th, Burgoyne and his 5,000 men officially surrendered to General Horatio Gates, marking the very first surrender of the British Army in world history. Not only that, but it also demonstrated that America now had a legitimate chance to defeat the British, and thus British strategy was changed for the remainder of the war. France recognized this and later became an American ally. This battle also gave Americans access to desperately needed resources, ones that would ultimately result in a successful conclusion of the war. During the winter months between 1777 and 1778, General Washington and his army settled at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which was about 20 miles from Philadelphia, which was still occupied by British forces. Despite suffering immense hardship from the cold, soldiers were transformed into a disciplined fighting force, mainly by Prussian officer Baron von Steuben. Steuben was essential in shaping the military despite harsh conditions. He taught them European-style battle tactics, many that would become the standard for modern military etiquette, including close order drills and standardized commands. Steuben also instituted proper hygiene and sanitation. Needless to say, this new and improved military was essential in winning the revolution, and on June 18th, the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge, and roughly 2,000 soldiers died. Following several more battles, burnings, and other countries taking notice of America's new independence, including the Netherlands, things all culminated in the Siege of Yorktown, which took place in September of 1781. At this time, both Britain and the Continental Army were growing exhausted following 6 years of war. On top of holding a few more places in America, they were also in a global war with Spain and France. Both sides desperately sought a victory, and that's exactly what they got. In October of 1781, the surrender of General Charles Cornwallis effectively broke the British war effort, leading to the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially recognized American independence. Later on, the British Army evacuated New York City, and Washington bid farewell to his officers. He then resigned in Annapolis, Maryland, and years later he was sworn in as the first ever U.S. president on April 30th, 1789. So with all this in mind, what exactly is the takeaway? Obviously, we should be grateful that these fine men fought for as long and hard as they did for our freedom, and I think we can all agree on that, among other things. But that's just one. Another takeaway should be, and could be, that they also fought because of a certain principle.
Taxation without representation.
No, not that one. A good principle. One that all men are created equal and therefore should be treated equal. Not under some law and not by unfair taxation, but should all be treated with equal respect and rights, no matter what race, gender, sex, origin, or even financial stance. Something that would take us a lot of trouble trying to learn in the next 250 years, but hey, we've come a long way. And it's important to look forward to what lies ahead. Like, imagine if we were still under British rule. That would suck. Well, on the bright side, we wouldn't have to pay oh wait, yeah, 2026. Inflation. Damn.